So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about popular misconceptions and how they lead to um, people taking positions that might be better avoided. So, the general thing is you start with a error about a physical reality. You start with an error about a particular distinct fact. But what it leads you to is a ideological or moral or political position that as itself has no validity because what it's based on is essentially an observation or an interpretation of facts that is incorrect. And we can see this on issues ranging from things like mountain bike access, which is something that's near and dear to me as a cyclist, to something of national political import and maybe not so local. Things like mountain biking park access tend to be local or county issues. Something like gun control, for example, is an issue that resonates all over the nation on both sides of the political spectrum. But you can find examples in both these types of things where people start with a flawed premise, with one grain of truth that's not actually truth at all, and what they end up with is a whole theory and a whole political position that's based on that misperception, and that therefore is has the same flaws in it throughout. And I'll use two very simple examples. Um, but basically, what this comes down to is know what you're talking about. If you don't, everything that develops downstream from that is going to be an error essentially. Um, and the problem is the more people devote to working for a political goal or to working for, pushing a certain idea or a certain approach, the less likely they are to actually retrace their steps, backtrack, check their basic premises, and say to themselves, "Oh my gosh, I was wrong." They become emotionally invested. And at that point, it's almost not a philosophical issue anymore, an intellectual issue. It's almost a psychological issue. They their emotions take over, and they're unwilling to reconsider because they've gone too far down that line of reasoning. Um, so let's take uh, the issue of guns. Now, all my life, I've thought shooting was cool. I do archery. I shoot bows. I own bows. Um, I shoot weekly, if not daily, and sometimes I do shoot daily. Um, Up until about a year ago, I'd never actually shot a firearm, although I was interested in them and I knew a lot about them, and I always thought they were cool. A friend of mine invited me to a firing range, and long story short, I ended up putting like 200 rounds through a Colt 1911 pistol, or a Springfield Armory variant of the Colt 1911. Um, and then after that, that was the 9 millimeter 1911. I allowed them to talk me into the 9 millimeter because the 45 was a bigger cartridge and had a little more kick, and I'd never fired a gun before. So I fired the 9 millimeter version, and then I fired a few shots from the 45, which they brought out at the end because I had expressed interest, and I thought that was very nice of them. The 45 they brought out was very high end. The 9 millimeter was a basic, no frills Springfield Armory version. The 45 was some, I don't even remember the brand. But it was really fancy, and it definitely did have a little more kick, but it is what it is. But the point is, up until recently, I had never fired a gun before, but I got the opportunity to do it, and it was. I have to say, I really appreciate what the people at the range did. They were very welcoming to a noob. They were very helpful. They were very safety conscious, um, and they, like people who engage in any other recreational activity, you know, if you pull aside a cyclist and you ask him to talk about his bike, he'll talk your ear off. I've done it. I've had it done to me by others, etc. You know, if you're into archery and you go to the archery range and you start talking to another archer, he'll talk to you till the cows come home about his bow, etc. Same thing here. Uh, the people recognize that, you know, the way to ensure, you know, that the sport continues is to get people interested in it and to spread the interest in it. So, you know, they want you to have a welcoming experience and not be scared or turned off to it, not be discouraged, etc. So, you know, they started me out with a lower caliber version of the gun that I was interested in. They started me out at a fairly close range, and then I took it on myself to move the target back. Um, and You know, I had a great time. I had such a great time when I left the target range. I actually accidentally left my cell phone in my friend's car. We took his car to get there. I was just so psyched. I left it there. You know, um, I got it back eventually, but you know, it was just I had a really good time. I was, in fact, I walked out of the range. One of the things I was thinking in my head was, I have got to get me one of these. And I actually asked the guy. I was like, you know, so what would it take for me to get one of these for my very own that I could, you know, like tinker with or take apart or whatever? And because you can't do that with a rented gun, obviously, you know, for liability reasons and whatnot, they wouldn't they wouldn't let you take it apart. So the guy starts explaining to me all the rules and rigmarole, and you know, just a newsflash for anybody who thinks that you can just walk into a gun store, a legitimate gun store, not something illegal, but an actual, you know, gun shop that's run as a business. Anybody who thinks you can just walk into one, give the guy money, and walk out with the gun and no questions asked is living in a fantasy world. Okay, because the when he started describing to me all the things I would have to do and all the hoops I would have to jump through to try and purchase one, you know, my very own 1911 pistol. Um, Frankly, I found it disconcerting. I found it discouraging, and I found it intimidating. Um, there was nothing about the experience that I found intimidating except the rules for purchasing your own gun, which had nothing to do with the shooting range and were, of course, instituted by the government. That should say something. I was so happy with my first experience as a firearm shooter that I walked out of it thinking, I've got to get me one of these. I'll start saving up. I'll save my money. And then I was like, oh, I don't know, man. I mean, that's a lot of scary personal questions and a lot of, you know, just ugh, it was weird. And the funny thing is, I've never been arrested. I've never been held for questioning. I've never been in trouble with the law in my life. And I was intimidated by the process. So, you know, anytime anybody tells you the laws are too lenient and anybody can just walk into a store and buy a gun, no. A million times no. They're already so strict that the average law abiding citizen is flummoxed by them. I mean, like I said, I walked out of there thinking, oh man, I want to get me one of these. The second thought I had was, wait, do I really want to invest that kind of time, energy, and money in a hobby if it's going to make me a target perhaps for some government prohibition and some, you know, jablon is going to come along and try to, you know, say I spend $800, I save for a year, and I spend $800 on a Colt 1911 pistol, and I spend the time and money and effort going to the range and the effort and sweat to learn how to get good with it, and then some jablon is just going to threaten to take that away because it makes him feel good and, you know, he doesn't like guns. Uh, no, I mean that's just not cool, you know. And if you think about it, it's not because I have anything to hide. It's not because I'm a criminal. It's not because I'm a bad person. It's not because I want to hurt anybody. It's because I'm a reasonable person looking at it, looking at the political climate in the state of New Jersey, and saying, you know what? You know, I really want to pursue this as a hobby, as an interest, as something that I, you know, could care about, but I don't want the hassle. I don't want the grief. I don't want the risk of some jablon threatening to put me in jail or confiscate my property. And I think that really goes to, you know, when people talk always about having new and stricter laws, I think we should consider that, you know, how strict are the laws already? And what's the impact that they have on law-abiding citizens? How many people are either flummoxed or confused or intimidated from participating in the shooting sports? And I mean, maybe that's the goal. After all, a lot of these gun control proposals are based on myths and misunderstanding about firearms. Myths and misunderstanding about firearms really only gain traction when you have more people than not who don't know anything about them and are ignorant of firearms. How do you guarantee that more and more people are ignorant of firearms? You discourage them from pursuing an interest in firsthand experience with firearms. So, in some ways, the gun control seems to be almost like a self-fulfilling um, process where you have rules in place that discourage the law-abiding from taking this up as a hobby or field of interest, and then as a result, you have fewer and fewer people in the general population in places that already have strict gun control that know anything about guns. So whenever anybody proposes, the next strict law, whatever that law happens to be, they're less likely to question all the problems with the logic behind it because they don't know anything about guns. Because the existing laws are already so strict, you've discouraged pretty much as many people as you could from becoming interested in that. So that certainly is an observation in and of itself. But I had a grand time at the firing range, and I really enjoyed it. But I did want to note that, yeah, I walked out of there thinking, oh, I'm going to get one of these, and I'm going to have a grand old time shooting it every month or every week. And then reality set in, and I was like, wait a minute, I live in a state that's run by a bunch of anti-gun people. Well, that's not cool, you know. Now, one of the gun myths that's gained a lot of traction, and this ties in with my experience at the shooting range. I had never fired a gun before, but you hear and you see things, and I've been at places where other people were firing guns. Um, Even something as simple as, in the Memorial Day parade, you have Revolutionary War reenactors firing muskets, right? Now, the muskets are pretty loud, but they're outdoors, and generally speaking, they're not that loud. They're loud, but they're not deafening. Here's the thing. The range I went to where I shot the 1911 pistol was an indoor shooting range, and we were all issued earmuffs, and we used them. And for me, it was kind of difficult because I was always taught to listen to people when they're speaking. It's a respect thing. You don't want to keep things over your ears when somebody's talking to you. So when the range instructor was talking to me, I was tempted I kept lifting the thing off one of my ears so I could hear him better, and so that I could signal that I was paying attention to what he was saying and I was being respectful and listening to him. The problem is at an indoor range where other people are already actively shooting, there's a lot of concussive sound waves from the guns going off in a confined space, usually with unfinished hard surfaces that reverberate the sound back. So, well, a gun shooting off outdoors, let's say a Revolutionary War reenactment in a parade, isn't all that loud. I mean, it's loud, but it's not that loud. Shooting a gun yourself or being in a room where people are shooting a gun indoors is very loud. And I found that I had to keep the ear protectors over my ears even when the person was speaking. I initially tried to lift them up to show some deference, but I was forced to keep them on because the sound was so loud. I was afraid it would damage my hearing. So I did have a really good time, but the one incongruous thing was the sound. The recoil actually didn't bother me. What bothered me most was the sound and the spent cases flying past my field of vision. Being a lefty, I was holding the firearm, this way, so the cases, of course, the 1911 ejects on the right side, and they were all going like this, which was interesting. I had practiced with an airsoft gun beforehand that was very realistic and had a reciprocating slide and all of that. But, of course, an airsoft gun shoots little plastic pellets using CO2, and it doesn't eject cartridges. So the idea of this hot brass flying past my face flying across my field of vision was a new experience. And the degree of sound was a new experience. That was very loud. And that's what I want to talk about, because one of the myths that's gained traction is that Silencers are a horrible thing. You heard this from presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. You've heard it from just about everybody else. Oh, people want to make silencers legal. That's awful. That will allow assassins to go around with guns, silently killing people. Pew, pew, pew. I mean, you'll be able to walk into a room and shoot somebody, and it won't disturb the Shakespeare reading across the hall. Well, I hate to tell you that's false. And this gets back to my initial point, which was I know there's a bit of a digression, but the initial point of you take an observation about reality that's factually incorrect, and you build a whole political position around it. And what you get is a political position that's based on a factual inaccuracy and is worthless as a source for policy. But people become emotionally invested with it and don't want to backtrack. So many people, and I don't know whether it's the presentation in Hollywood movies where a silencer does indeed reduce a gunshot to pew, 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 or what. But for some reason, people believe that silencers make guns silent. Now, there are three things that are involved with a gun firing in terms of making noise. There's the explosion of the primer and then the main charge in the cartridge. There's the metallic clack of the parts hitting each other as the slide reciprocates. And then there is the sound of the bullet itself traveling through the air, breaking the sound barrier. People who actually do want to use a silenced gun for purposes of stealth, let's say to engage in some nefarious thing like a Navy SEALs on an assassination mission or something, they will use what's called subsonic ammunition. So the silencer reduces the sound of the gunshot itself, the explosion, and then the bullet itself is slower, has a reduced charge, so that it's not breaking the sound barrier and making its own noise, which is very audible. Nobody can really do all that much about the mechanical clack of the slide reciprocating. That's just part of the gun shooting. If it's a semi-auto pistol, like a Colt 1911, for example, or a Beretta 92F, or a Glock, or anything else. Anything that's not basically a revolver or single shot. So you have three noises. You have the concussion of the explosion, you have the slide reciprocating, and you have the sound of the bullet breaking the sound barrier. Even if you have a silencer, you're still going to have the loud bang of the slide going back, and you're still going to have the noise made by the bullet breaking the sound barrier. So a silencer doesn't actually make a gun quiet. It just lowers the decibel level to the point where you're less likely to get permanent hearing damage. And that was my point behind stressing how loud the guns were at this indoor shooting range. If you've never fired a gun at an indoor shooting range or in a condition where you're going to hear the sound, if you're out in a field somewhere, it may not sound as loud. If you're in an indoor shooting range or a place like that, you realize how loud the sound actually can be under certain conditions. And you begin to understand why movements to legalize silencers in places where they're not legal have a momentum. I mean, it's the same reason. Could you imagine if there were people who opposed putting mufflers on cars and motorbikes? Nobody in their right mind would argue for that. One thing, the noise would rise to the level of a nuisance for anybody in the vicinity while the vehicle is being operated. But secondly, it might even, cause hearing impairment for the operator. There's a reason that cars have mufflers and motorcycles have mufflers. And the exhaust systems don't just have mufflers. They have something called a resonator that's included that further reduces the vibrations before it even gets to the muffler. I know this because I worked on my old 91 Honda Civic once. I went to Pep Boys, I got some pipe, and I got a muffler, and I installed it myself, and the original pipe rotted away. And I didn't realize that I had to put a resonator chamber on there. And even with the muffler, the thing sounded like a motorboat. In a way, it was good because I learned to shift by judging the sound. I didn't even have to look at the tack anymore. It was a stick shift. But the downside was every time I came home later at night, it woke up all the neighbors. I mean, I was in college at the time, and I'd be pulling in it, 1 a.m. after coming back from the coffee shop, and you'd hear brrr, and it became a nuisance. So much so that I went back to a proper auto garage and had a proper exhaust line installed with not only a new muffler but a resonator. So there's a reason that you don't want excessive decibels from your motor vehicle. Is it that much of a stretch to believe that you also wouldn't want excessive decibels from shooting, especially if somebody shoots on a daily basis. Yes, you can have ear protection, but wouldn't it be better just to have the gun not be as loud? And as far as worrying that it's going to allow the gun to be completely silent and you'll be able to like shoot somebody in one room and not disturb the poetry reading across the hall, sorry, that's a myth. That's fiction. That's an invention of Hollywood and dime writers and people who have an axe to grind. It's not based on actual firsthand facts about the guns and the silencers and what they do. However, what we've seen is a political momentum to keep things like silencers illegal because I guess they really believe that they work in a way that they don't. I mean, the only other thing I can conclude is that gun control proponents want people to go deaf, which sounds silly. But then doesn't it also sound silly to propose keeping something restricted or illegal because you think it does something that it doesn't? I mean, why don't you just learn something about reality and about the facts involved and then base your arguments on that? Nope. They got to base their arguments on preconceived notions and just run with it. And to hell with reality. Oh, what do I care if people go deaf? You know? I mean, it sounds absurd. But there you go. An entire political movement, the continued restriction of silencers, has grown up around a fact that's not a fact at all, but a misperception about the facts. A misperception about what a silencer does and why somebody would want one. I'll give you a hint. It has nothing to do with assassinating somebody. It has everything to do with frequent shooters at a shooting range not wanting to go deaf. Okay? I mean, common sense. But common sense is apparently not so common anymore. And we see this with cycling. When I spent 3 years working for Mountain Bike Access at Watchung Reservation here in Union County, New Jersey. And every time we went to a county freeholder meeting and we talked to people and we, put forth arguments, we were met with everything under the sun you can think of about mountain biking. Not only was most of it just flat out wrong and should have been rejected by the freeholders out of hand because it had no factual basis. It was literally the fevered imaginings of people who were freaking out about something that didn't exist. But they repeatedly doubled down on their misperceptions, and everything they said only illustrated that, yes, they cared about the issue, but they knew absolutely nothing about it per se. And so, it was all the more shocking when ultimately the freeholders, after spending 3 years promising to overturn their ban on mountain biking in Watchung, which was imposed in a backroom deal by a handful of the unelected 20 years ago in 1995, without any documentation of a single problem at Watchung with mountain biking that it was allegedly trying to address, by repurposing an old ordinance that was about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars, but which they decided to pretend referred to the dirt trails in the park. After 3 years of promising repeatedly that they were going to allow mountain bike access, after hiring a consultant and paying them tens of thousands of taxpayers' dollars to design a new trail plan that included mountain biking, after specifically approving the part of the trail plan that included mountain biking and changing the contract to specifically pay the contractor, CME Associates, more money specifically for that part of the contract, the Union County freeholders then canceled the mountain biking part of the trail plan, presumably in response to the hysterical, fevered imaginings of the mountain bike opponents, whose arguments only illustrated that they knew nothing about mountain biking. I mean, one of them was, for example, saying that they thought we'd be going too fast for safety. When asked to explain what they meant by too fast, this person said that they thought we'd be traveling at 40 miles an hour. Now, it's possible to reach 40 miles an hour on a steep downhill on a paved road on a road bike. But I don't know anybody who rides that fast on a mountain bike on a recreational off-road dirt trail. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to reach a speed like that outside of a professional downhill mountain bike course. Certainly, on a public recreational cross-country or, just riding around trail, that's not going to happen. I've been bicycling for over a quarter century, and my average speed on mountain bike rides tends to be between 10 and maybe 14 miles an hour if I'm pushing it. So what explains this? Well, the person either obviously had an axe to grind, not wanting to allow mountain bike access, or they were misinformed. But the point is that just like with the silencers, you have a policy that continues to be based on these misperceptions. And what people need to realize is that this doesn't do anybody any good, okay? Whether you're talking about tax policy, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking about foreign policy, whether you're talking about gun control, or whether you're talking about some local mundane issue like bike trail access, you should be basing your government policy on actual observable facts on the ground. You shouldn't be basing it on delusions, fears, paranoia, phobias, biases, ignorance, or misperceptions. Okay? But that's what so many people seem to be doing. A lot of the crap that we have to deal with in modern society, life is a lot simpler than people make it out to be. Just ignore anything that's not factually based. Half of the stuff would just go away. Half of these issues aren't even issues. Oh, mountain biking is going to wreck the woods. No, it's not. Oh, people want silencers. That must mean every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants to be an assassin. No, etc. And you know what? It's amazing how many of these fears and these boogeymen and the rationale for these restrictive rules and therefore these policy debates just disappear like flatulence in the wind when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of what's the reality of the subject. If you just look at the facts, all of a sudden you realize, wait, these guys that want to conduct the government like a pirate ship, they don't have a peg leg to stand on, okay? The people that want to restrict, your hobby or your interest or your way of life or what you do or outlaw your property or whatever, the only thing they're reacting to is their own phobias, their own prejudices, their own misunderstandings. And I'm sorry, but phobias, prejudices, and misunderstandings shouldn't be the basis for government policy, okay? If we're going to have a government policy about any issue under the sun, it should be the least intrusive as possible, balancing a sense of fairness with a sense of efficacy. And to accomplish both of those goals, it has to be based on reality. It has to be based in this world and on the facts that we can verify. And the fact is, silencers don't work like they do in the movies. And, mountain bikers aren't some menace to trail users everywhere. And, yet on both these issues, hysterical, fear-mongering, ignorant, uneducated, foolish, and stupid people carried the day. And I am shocked, I tell you, that this seems to be the norm in our society right now. You look around America or even the world, and the people that get the most airtime on any given issue are the people that know the least about it. They might be shouting the loudest. They might be the most extreme. They might be the most far out, or colorful. But they're the people who actually know the least at the end of the day. All right? I mean, just to take a classic case, another example from gun control, all those people who think a civilian semi-automatic rifle is a military-style assault rifle. I'll give you a hint. It's not. Why is that? Well, it's not select fire. And if you don't know what that means, you really need to do some research before you start suggesting to people who do know what it means what the legal status of those firearms should be. So we should be basing policy on facts and not on myths and misperceptions. And we should be aware as a society, as we consider these issues, everything from foreign policy to healthcare to crime and gun control to park access for cyclists, that the person who is the loudest and who gets the most airtime might actually be the person who actually has the least to contribute to the debate. Maybe we shouldn't be basing government policy on volume alone. Maybe we should be basing it on understanding. Just a thought. A novel thought, I know, but worth putting out there. After all, what kind of society do you want to live in? One where people's misguided and bigoted fears rule the day, or one where people can actually sit down and, actually look at the facts and try and come up with a policy that's fair and based on reality. I don't know about you. I'd rather take the second choice. And I think if you thought about it, you would too. Lone Rider out.